Hello, this is Brett Lonsdale from Lightning Tools, and I want you to all welcome Sandy Ussia, who is with us today to present Automating with Microsoft Flow. So I'm going to pass over to Sandy in just a moment and allow her to introduce herself. I just wanted to go through a couple of things. Whilst Sandy is presenting, we're going to first of all record the meeting, and that recording will be made available through our website. So if you go onto our website, you will see there is a webinars link at the on the top menu, and you'll be able to get to the webinar that way. But you'll also receive an email as well with a link to the email, so you can watch it back at your leisure. There will also be the opportunity to ask questions at the end of the webinar, and everybody is on mute at the start. So what you will find is if you familiarize yourself with it now, there is the ability to raise your hand using the GoToWebinar software, and anybody with their hand raised, I'll be facilitating that. I'll unmute you and you can ask your question with Sandy, and Sandy will be able to answer it. Yeah, if you also want to ask questions that you don't want to speak openly on the webinar, then also feel free to email Sandy as well, and well, she will be handing over those details in just a moment. So let's welcome Sandy. So over to you, Sandy.
Thanks, Brett. Hi, everybody. Welcome to this introduction to Microsoft Flow. I hope you're all ready to learn some Flow basics. And by the end of this webinar, you should be able to create some flows of your own, and I hope that you also get some ideas of some creative flows that you can come up with. And at the end, as Brett said, we'll have time for some questions, and you'll also be able to get a link to the slides. And so let's begin. First, just a little bit about me. I come from a SharePoint background, is how I came to Flow. Currently, I'm a Business Applications MVP, which includes Flow and Power Apps and Dynamics and Power BI. But my focus has been on SharePoint, so we'll be doing some SharePoint things with our Flow demos today, but you'll see that it works in a lot more platforms than that. I'm currently Global Partner Manager for Lightning Tools, and I am a digital nomad, which I'm always happy to talk to people about if you want to talk to me about that later. There you can see all my details, the ways to get in touch with me. Probably one of the best ways is on Twitter. I'm at SandyU there, and you can email me also, and you'll get this again at the end. So why are we interested in Microsoft Flow? Mainly, we want to be able to automate business processes and also enhance personal productivity. You'll see throughout this webinar some ways to do just that in both business and personal venues. There are connectors available to not only Microsoft platforms and services, but also lots of other business-related services, but also personal type services like Twitter and Facebook. So you can use Flow for quite a range of things that you want to automate. So you can use multiple services within a single flow, and we'll see some examples of that. And it has a very nice, I think, intuitive interface that's based on a diagram. So we'll actually go through building a flow throughout this webinar, and you'll see exactly how that works. And it is the successor to SharePoint Designer workflows. As those of you who use SharePoint will know, SharePoint Designer is no longer being added to, and it will be out of support pretty soon. So things have more actions and more features have been added to Microsoft Flow to get that up to where you could have used SharePoint Designer for things in the past. And in addition, Flow brings actually a lot more to the workflow interface, being able to connect to all these other services as well. So what we're going to do is actually jump right onto the live interface, assuming that the internet plays with me correctly. And then we'll come back to the slides, but I wanted to let you know though, when you receive the slides at the end, you'll be able to see screenshots of all of the things that we're going to talk about and tips and so on. But we're going to do it live rather than look at the slides. That's boring. So I'm going to go to Flow. So you access it by going to flow.microsoft.com. And that takes you to the Flow homepage. So here, to begin, I would say a good place to start, if you haven't done any flows before, is to look at some of the templates that Microsoft has provided. There are literally hundreds, maybe even thousands at this point, of templates that are available to you. We'll take a look at a couple of those. So if I scroll down through here, you can see there are templates that let you do just all kinds of things. Some are created by Microsoft, some have been created by members of the Flow community and uploaded into the template area. You can, this is in order by popularity right now, but I could look, say, for example, I want to do some sort of approval. I can look at those type of templates. I say I want to see what all can I do that has to do with SharePoint. I can search for that and so on. So that I'm still under approvals. So they're a good place to start. It's quite possible that whatever you're thinking of doing, there has been a template designed for it already. And so rather than reinvent the wheel, it couldn't hurt to take a look through the templates. And then even if you find one that's kind of close to what you want, you could start with that and then add to it. So let's just see an example of how this might, of how the templates work. I'm going to clear my search. And let's say I want to do this template here, save Office 365 email attachments to OneDrive for Business. That's actually one that I use personally a lot. What that does for you is, if I click on it, and I'll show you how to use a template, that means that anytime you get an email into your Office 365 email account, then the attachments will automatically get saved into a library that you specify in your OneDrive for Business. That way they'll always be available in the cloud and you don't have to go back searching through your emails for the attachments that came in. It's quite a cool little template. And so you'll see that when you click to add a template, it'll automatically add any connections that already exist for you. So I already have credentials for OneDrive for Business and for Office 365 Outlook under my tenant. And if I click Create Flow, then it just goes ahead and creates that flow. And that's it. Now it's created, and now it would run anytime that happens. In this case, it's got a 2 after it because I've already actually got this flow in my environment. But then I can see that if I go to my flows, and now I can see this new flow that was just added. And I could go in and edit it. If I wanted to make some change, maybe I would want to add a step, for example. But you can, and this is a good way of learning also, using the templates, because you can see what has been done in the past to achieve a particular goal. We're not going to dwell on this one right now because I want to show you all kinds of other features, but you get the idea. So a template is a good place to start, I think. But you can also start from scratch. You can create anything that you want. And to do that, we'll look at some of the connectors that are available. As of today, there are 233 connectors available. So as you can tell, this is not only Microsoft services, but lots and lots of other services. I'll scroll through this a little bit, but you'll probably see the logos of some various services that you yourself might use in your daily work. And so you can connect to any of those things. One thing I want to point out is there's a little difference between connectors, which are all of these ability to connect to these various services, and then a connection. A connection is what you yourself have created between yourself and one of these services. So that means that you've entered your credentials for that service. And I can always see what connections I have already built by going to the cog icon and selecting connections. So this will show all of the connectors that I've already connected to. It's best practice to not create an additional connection to an existing connector unless you have different credentials, of course. So this just shows you what all things you've set up a connection to already. And you can see another kind of interesting thing about this is you can see, for example, where all that's been used. If you go to the details of a connection, you can see if you have any Power Apps that are using that connection and any flows that are using that connection, for example. So that helps if you are having trouble, say, with your login, or you think you might want to delete and redo a connection. You'd want to check first and make sure if you've already, it's not being used currently in some active flow, as an example. But if I want to go ahead and create a new flow, I would do that from my flows and go to new up on the top menu and create from blank. Here again, I could create from template if I wanted to from here. But I'm going to create from blank. And so the basic structure of any flow is that it must start with some trigger. There has to be something that kicks off the flow, that makes it begin. So you can see on the screen here, they list some popular triggers. For example, when a new email arrives, and you could specify, it arrives to a certain folder, or it arrives from a certain person, or has a certain subject, and so on. Things like when a new tweet is posted could be when a new tweet is posted with a certain hashtag that you want something to happen, and so on. So I could choose one of those if I wanted, or I could just go ahead and say that I want to search the hundreds of connectors and triggers. So I'm going to do that just so that you can see how that interface works. So that brings us up to the flow diagram, the flow canvas, I guess you could call it, the diagram. So first thing, again, is to create some trigger. So in my example I'm going to use, we're going to use a SharePoint list and get expenses approved if an item is added to the SharePoint list. So I want my trigger to be when an item is added to a SharePoint list. But you can see, though, there are lots and lots of basically almost all of the services have triggers available for them. And by the way, if you click on one of the services on that connectors screen, it'll take you to documentation about that connector, and that will show you what triggers are available, what actions are available, and do some explanation about each one. So that's a really helpful learning resource. So I can see what all triggers, what all services have triggers available, or I could search if I know I'm doing something with SharePoint. I can search for that again, and I've expanded that. So I'm gonna, I'll choose SharePoint. And so then you can see now what all triggers are available for SharePoint, and there are a fair number of them. One thing to note here is you'll see, for example, when a file is created versus when an item is created. So that's something to watch out for. The file has to do with document libraries, and item has to do with SharePoint lists. So I'm going to use when an item is created in my example here. So now I've added that trigger when an item is created, and I need to choose in what list I'm having flow check for. So it first needs the site address of where the list is, so that's on my CandyU site. And then based on what I chose there, it'll show me a filtered list of the lists that are available. If I had chosen when a file is created, then it would have shown me document libraries instead. So I'm going to use this expense claim list that I already had created. And so there's my trigger. The next thing that I would always want to do is add some step. Of course, the only reason for making a flow is that you want something to happen if something else happens. So I would create a new step here, which adds an action. So now it's listing, rather than the triggers, you can see here there are triggers available, but here we're doing an action, so it's listing all of the actions available. And again, I could search for what I know that I need, that what I'm trying to happen, but I want to look at a couple of these actions with you, just to give you some ideas of what's available. So for example, if I look at the built-in actions, that's things like logic actions, such as condition, which is a yes, no. We're going to add that actually. Things like a switch, which would be if you've got multiple choices, so say you've got high, medium, and low priorities, you could use the switch control to do various actions depending on the value of the priority. Apply to each and do until are looping type controls. So there, for example, if you, and a good example is that email attachments template. When you get an email, it may have multiple attachments, so the attachments need to be saved as separate files, and so there was an apply to each built into that template flow, so that each attachment is saved to as a file. There are also things under the built-in actions, such as date time actions, like I can do things like convert time zone, or add or subtract from days and times. I can do things like data operations, such as creating HTML tables and filtering arrays. So there are a lot of choices there. Under the standard actions, this is where most of the things fall, and so just to kind of scroll down here a little bit, it's got kind of popular ones, and then, yeah, so you can choose whatever service you're interested in and find the related action. What I want to do is actually go ahead and use the condition control, because I want to say that if my expense claim is over $500, then I want to get it, then it needs to be approved. So when I click in this condition and where it says choose a value, you can see that it has popped up this dialog for dynamic content. And so what that means is it's taking values from previous steps in the flow. And if I had had 2 or 3 steps previous to this, then I would see different sections in here based on the different actions that there were. Right now, all of these are just things that are coming from my trigger when an item is created. So you can see you have access to all of these different bits of information about that SharePoint item. And every trigger has its own set of dynamic content that you can access in the downstream actions. So what I want to do is check the expense amount, and I want to check if it is greater than, let's say, 500. And you can see when I added the condition action, then it automatically gave me an if yes and if no. So I can add different actions depending on what the result of that condition is. So all I'm going to do in this really simple demo, because we have a lot to cover, is I'm going to just add an approval action. So I'll add an action under the yes side, and I know I want it to do something to do with approvals, so I'll start typing approval. And there is a specific approval connector. And so that is an approval experience that Flow has. So I'm going to use that, start an approval. You could also do something like just send an email if you want, but this approval action actually gives you some more options, such as I can say the approval type that I want. In this case, I'm going to say anyone from the assigned list. I could make it everyone, meaning that if I list a bunch of people or a group, then everyone must approve the item. And once I do that, then it gives me the chance to fill in a bunch of other fields. So for the title of this approval, I'm going to say, please approve. And the thing I want to be approved is going to come from the item that I created. I'll use the title of the item. And who I want to assign that approval to, I could have, if I had more time in a demo, I could have had a step in there to get the name of my manager, assuming that that has been populated in your Active Directory, and that could be who I'm assigning it to. But I'm going to put a specific, just a specific person. Oops, and I'll spell it right. So this is another person that exists in my tenant. Added a semicolon there. And the name of the requester is going to be who created the item. So you can see that's coming from the when an item is created, the email address of the person who created it. So that is what I want here. It filtered out that dynamic content because Flow knows that what should go here is an email address. So that's why those are the only two data items that I'm seeing. But if I wanted to see all of them, I could click on See More, and then I would be able to see all of the fields that came back from there. So Flow tries to be smart about that, but you'll find that sometimes you might not see a field that you really do need, and so you can click on See More to be able to find that. So I want the created by email, and then in the details, you see it says Markdown supported, so I could use the Markdown language to write some really fancy thing, but I'm going to just say that the person who created the item, the display name of the person who created that, has spent, and then I want the expense amount, and you can see that that is one of the things that is not showing up. So I click See More, and then I can get my expense amount. Actually, I want to put a $sign there, and expense amount. Then I can include an item link, which is link to item, and that will automatically generate that. And if I put an item link description, then rather than putting a big ugly URL, then the approval will show some text. So I'll just say click here. All right, so that should do it for my approval. One thing that I do want to do before I save it is name this. So right now you can see at the top it's untitled. And if I just hit save, then it's going to save it as the name of the trigger, which would be when an item is created, but that's really quite generic. So I want to say something like approve expense claim as my title. And then I will click save. Obviously, you could have more to do with this. You could probably in real life, you would want to send an email. You know, if the item gets approved or rejected, you want to send different emails back to the person who created it. If the expense was less than 500, I would probably want to do something on the no side, like maybe just say, go ahead and purchase it or something like that. But just for the purposes of this demo, we're just doing a simple two-step flow. So I'm going to save that. And then I can go back. If I click back to the previous page, it'll take me, yeah, I already saved it, so yes, I do want to leave. It'll take me to that Flow's dashboard. And so I want to look at a couple things on this dashboard. For one thing, anytime you go to a Flow's dashboard, you can add a description here, which is a nice idea so that future you and other people in your organization can see what this flow is doing. I can do things like seeing analytics. There aren't any, of course, for this flow yet because it hasn't run. Same with the run history. This will show you the last 30 days of run history for your flow and whether the flows succeeded or failed, and then you can go into each one and see exactly what happened. So we'll do that after it has run. It'll show you the connections that this particular flow is using and the owners of this flow. Right now, that's just me, but I could add another owner, and that would make it a team flow. So let's just see how that would work. I could, if I type in somebody's name or a group, then that person or group would then have access to be able to edit this flow as well. They're an actual owner of the flow. I can also choose the SharePoint list itself. Since this one is based on a SharePoint list, I could choose that list as the owner, and then anyone who has access to edit access to that list then also has edit access to the flow. That's a relatively new feature, by the way. So I go back to that dashboard again. I can also, right from here, do things like go back and edit the flow. I can do things such as export it in a package. If I want to give this flow as a zip file to someone else, and they can import it into their own environment and put in their own credentials to run it, then you can do that. I could submit it as a template to Microsoft if I think it's something that doesn't already exist in the templates and that people would be interested in doing. I can share it, which is the same thing. It'll let you add another owner. And I could save as, which would make a copy of the flow. So that's a helpful thing to do if you want to be able to just have a copy, but then maybe have it running on a different list or tweak it in some other way. Okay, so let's see what happens when I run this flow. I'll go back and go out to my expense claim list and add a new item. And let's say I want to take a trip. And I'll put in a date. Let's say on the weekend. And that's going to cost $1,200. It's a really expensive trip. And I'll save that. All right. It's not liking my date. Okay, this is some SharePoint thing. Let's try this. All right. Okay, I'm going to try that again because I know that it worked before. Sorry. Yeah, I don't think that's helping. All right, that seems like it's working that time. I don't know. All right, so I've added my item, and now if I go into manage my flows, I should see, if I refresh that the flow has triggered because I added a new item. So I can see that it's currently running, and if I click on that while it's running, it'll show me the steps in the flow, and this is really useful for doing troubleshooting. I really like how Flow does this. So it shows you what happened. So the trigger did occur, the item was created, and I can expand that and see exactly what happened. I can see what the inputs were, which is just the name of the list. I can see the outputs, which were the things that I filled in. And again, this is really helpful if you're troubleshooting and you want to see what values are related to what items in that dynamic content. You can see that by actually running the flow and see what those outputs are. So right now it's saying I've got this sort of clock symbol, which means that it's sitting here waiting for the approval. It started the approval, but it didn't get approved yet. So I'm going to switch over to my other user's email. And I can see that the email came in, please approve the trip. And so it has the details that I specified, that I've spent $1,200, and it has the link that I can click to go to that actual item if the approver wants to see more information about it. And let's say we want to approve it, and I could give a reason of some sort and then click submit. So now that approval has been submitted right from the email. So the person doesn't need to actually go into SharePoint. So that makes it a good idea to put as much information as you can into those details to make it easier for your managers, because we know how managers don't like to go into other things. So if I now look at my flow without having changed anything or switching screens, it already now has a green check mark by the start approval, because that means that step did happen. And I can expand that and see what happened there, that that Pliny did approve it. And again, in real life, then you'd want to send an email back to the person who created the item and let them know that that happened. So some other things that I want to show you on this screen before we leave it, though, are I could go from here, I could resubmit. So say I just changed some little thing and I want to resubmit it as a test. Or I could, some other testing that I could do is I could go back to the edit mode for this flow, and I can use the test feature up here in the right corner. This is also really helpful when you're troubleshooting a new flow that you've created. I can click test, and I could either do the trigger myself or use data from previous runs. So here's the run I just did, which succeeded, and I could say I want to use that data. That way, if I want, say I wanted to add some steps to this and retest it, but I don't want to keep on adding items to my SharePoint list just to trigger the flow, I can test it by using this test on a previous run. And when I click test, then it would just do the same thing again. Okay. So I'm just going to make sure I'm not missing anything here of the steps that I wanted to do. Right, some other things that you can do while you're in edit mode is you can learn more about the triggers and actions. So there's the little eye icon here, the little information icon within any trigger or action. And so if you click on that, it'll show you, it'll explain what it is, but also learn more lets you go right to the documentation for that, which is a really handy way to learn things as well. So that's taking me to that SharePoint connector, but also directly to this trigger that I've used when an item is created. So I would really recommend that too as a way of learning more about what things you can do with Flow. Over on the side, you get your More menu, and that lets you do different things depending on where you are. So here, I could rename an action or a trigger, but right now it's grayed out. I can't rename this when an item is created because I've already used the outputs of that trigger downstream in my flow. So that's a key point, that if you do want to rename actions or triggers, which is generally a good idea if you're going to have a very complex flow at all, because then you can see at a glance without having to necessarily expand it, you can see exactly what that item, what that trigger is doing. So I might have said here, I might have renamed it when I was first starting out, when an expense claim is submitted, and that would be maybe a better explanation of what's happening. But now I can't rename it because I've already used the output. So that's a key tip. If you want to rename one, do it before you add the other actions. I could add a comment here though, so I could add a comment saying that that's what's going on here, that it's when an expense claim item is added. Another good place for a comment is if you're using expressions. So if I go in here, for example, just to show you that, if I'm in a value field, for example, I could go to the expression tab here, and I have access to lots and lots of expressions, which are basically functions that let you do various manipulation with the values. So there are, as you see, string functions, things having to do with arrays, logical functions. There are amounts and various conversions, math functions, date time, which are very useful. And each of those has also see more, so there are even more functions than that. Expressions is really kind of a whole other topic in itself, though, so I'm not going to really get into that other than just showing you that they exist. But once you've created one, what shows up over on your flow is just sort of a purple token showing that you have a function there, an expression. So that's a good use of the add a comment, is if you have something that includes an expression, then you could copy out the text of the expression in the comment, and that way you can see it at a glance without having to actually reopen the expression. Another pro tip. I could go to settings, so each trigger and action has settings. Some are different than others, so this is a little different because it's a trigger. And again, this is beyond the scope of this webinar, but just to let you know that they're there. So you might want to check out what the settings are on your various actions and whether you could change things such as a timeout value and things like that. I could configure run after, depending on, again, where I am. I can't do that on a trigger, and I also can't do it on something that comes right after a trigger, and so actually I don't have anything here where I can configure that. But what that would let me do is, say, for example, I only want a step to run if the previous step has failed. So that might be sort of an alert kind of an email. You know, if a file creation has failed, then I want to get an email about it so that I can handle it or handle it in some automated way. And I can delete an action, but I can't delete this trigger right now because, again, I've already used it. But if I go down to my start approval action, I could delete that. And then it shows what connections are being used for that particular action. So in this case, when the item is created, I've got various connections that connect to SharePoint, but I'm using my Sandy View one. Okay, if we go back to my flows, some other things I just wanted to show you are things that you can do from this screen. So this is the way that you can see all of your flows, of course. You can also see if there are any team flows. So these would be the ones that you have shared with other people, and there are other owners, so I can see which ones those are. And then business process flows is relatively new, and I don't happen to have any, but that has mostly to do with the common data service and things that run in it's on the tip of my tongue, the other type of Power Apps. Sorry, it's slipping my mind just at the moment. But so from here, the things that I can do on this screen, something that is brand new, is I can search. So if I want to find any flows I wrote that have to do with emails, or that I put email in the name of it, then I can search for that, which is quite a handy addition, especially if you've accumulated a number of flows. I can, for any flow that I'm looking at, I can go right into editing it or sharing it or doing any number of these other commands, which we kind of already looked at from the dashboard. But so say, for example, I want to export that. I'll just show you what that looks like. It gives me the chance to name that as whatever I want to name the zip file, and it shows what would be in the package and the resources that are involved, which are basically the connections. So normally you would leave that for select during import, because then if I say send this zip file to someone who's using an entirely different tenant, then they can import it into their tenant and choose their own credentials, but the flow is doing the same functionality. So I'm going to cancel that. Another thing that you can do there is, let's look at, for example, the analytics. So here I've got a flow where I'm saving items from my Outlook calendar to my Google Calendar, copying basically, because this is another handy flow, personal productivity tip. Since I have an Android phone, I have a widget for my Google Calendar, but most of my actual events come up in Outlook, in one or more of my Outlook inboxes. So I have a flow that takes calendar items from all of my Outlook calendars and puts them all into Google Calendar. So what I could do here, for example, is see the analytics, since this is one that runs fairly often. And this is, by the way, a premium feature, so it doesn't come with the free flow, just so you're aware. But that'll show you up to the last 30 days of runs of the flow, which might be interesting for adoption and just usage statistics. And here I could turn the flow off if I wanted to, so you can see that hopefully that some of these flows are kind of lighter in color and they have a little off symbol there, and that means that those ones are currently turned off, and I could turn them back on using this menu as well. But so if I don't really want that to be running anymore, say I am just doing some testing on it, I could turn that flow off from here. And the last thing I want to show you, I think, on this dashboard is that you can get to an admin center from here. And here, as an admin only, you can see the flows that exist, and you can do things like change the ownership and so on. So say you had somebody who created a flow and they neglected to add anyone else as an owner, which is probably a good practice, generally speaking, in an organization. But now that person has left, the admin can come in, go to that environment. I know I need to upgrade that, and go to resources and flows and see all the flows that exist in this environment. And then I, as the administrator, could go into any flow and make myself, for example, an owner, or add other people as additional owners. I can turn flows off and on. So, if you as the admin see that a flow is sort of running amok for some reason, something was done wrong with the logic or something, you could come in and turn that off yourself. But as I said, as I think I said, the ability to go into these different environments is a premium feature as well. You can do data policies and look at your quotas and things as under the flow license that comes with Office 365, but to actually be able to administer flows, that's part of the premium license, which we'll look at here in a minute. Okay, so I think that covers everything in the UI, and I want to go back to our slides then, because there are a couple things that it wasn't so easy to show in the UI. One is that there's a Flow app for your phone. So you can download that from, it's either available for iOS or Android, and that lets you, probably the most useful thing there is that you can add buttons. There's a thing called a flow button, and that's a trigger which you can actually add to your mobile device and then just push the button and have things, have the flow triggered. You can also include inputs with that button. So for example, when you click on the button, maybe it'll ask you for your name or ask you for some piece of data that is needed for the flow. But also it'll automatically record things like, for example, the location of where you are when you click that button. So if that's important to the flow, then you've got that. You can also actually do almost anything with Flow from the Flow app. So I can see what all flows have run. I can actually create new flows right from the app. The design interface is a little small, but you can do it. And you can share buttons with other users too. So, if you create a nifty button like I'm going to be late for work, where you just have to click the button and it sends an email to your boss, for example, then you could share that button link with your coworkers and they can do it too. Okay. Another thing you can do with flows is use them in Power Apps. We don't have time to get into exactly how, but within Power Apps, there's a flow action. Oftentimes you would attach that to a button in Power Apps, and then there's a Power Apps trigger within Flow so that Power Apps can send information, or actually Flow gets information from Power Apps, and you specify what all parameters you want to come into the flow from the Power App. So as an example, that might be something like my expense claim form. Maybe instead of a SharePoint list, I had a Power App for that, where I've entered the data in a Power App and then click a button to submit it, and then it goes through the approval process in Flow. Another couple just examples to give you some ideas of things that you can do. When you go through and add a flow that is attached to a selected item, then you can set up a launch panel, which asks the user for some input, and then that input is used later in the flow. Actually, that reminds me that I did forget one thing, sorry. I wanted to show you within a list itself. So if I'm in a SharePoint list, for example, and I click on the Flow dropdown, I have some options that are just available here. So for example, here I can set a reminder. That's pretty new. In fact, I think it's not available in all tenants yet. But if I have a date column within this list, then I could set a reminder based on that date column. And this is actually a flow that is built in and runs. If I click on that, then I'll just do that. It'll create a new flow that's not actually available in your My Flows, I believe, but it goes ahead and makes the connections that are necessary to do that. It should do. Yeah, so it's going to send me an email reminder, and I could say how many days ahead. So if that date was, somewhere in the future, then I could get myself to send an email reminder and create that flow. Another thing you can do right from this menu is I can configure flows. So let's say here this has to do with approvals. Whether or not I want to allow approvals or not. So there's a built-in request sign-off, and content approval is kind of the standard SharePoint approval. But if I have request sign-off turned on like this, then, which it already is, then if I select an item and go to the flow drop-down, then that request sign-off appears on my list. And that, again, kicks off a new flow that sends an approval request to whoever you specify in that case. So it's a little different from the one that I created where I specified a person actually in the flow. In this request sign off, you specify the approver right within that, that menu. Okay, I'm going to go back to my slides. Sorry, I forgot about that. And another option that might be of interest is that there are actually physical inputs that are available. There are a couple different physical buttons that you can buy that you can connect to Flow. Flick is one of them, so it's a little, probably like a 1-inch diameter button that you can carry around with you or attach to your belt or something, I guess, and click it whenever you want to begin a flow. So where I've seen use cases for that come up are, for example, maybe service workers who are going out onto a job. They could click the flick button to say they've arrived at the site, and that records things like the location, date, time, and so on that they clicked the button, and then they could click it again when they've left the site. Some other kind of interesting triggers and actions are, there's a recurrence trigger, so you can have a flow that runs every so many minutes, days, months. There are lots of options for that, and then that'll just trigger automatically at that time. You can get really granular with that too, so you could say it triggers every Wednesday at 6:00 p.m. and have your flow run at that time, do some kind of notifications or something. Another useful action that we didn't really talk about was delay. So that could be, you know, if you want to wait sometime, so maybe I've added some document to a library, but then I want to wait 7 days and then send some kind of reminder to somebody, or that could have to do with the approval too, that I want to remind somebody if it hasn't been approved after a while. So those are good, give you some examples just to hopefully get your creative juices flowing a bit. So now I just want to talk a little bit about licensing, or I'll show you a little bit about it. Generally speaking, you get Flow for free if you're using Office 365 at all. You should see that in your list of apps that you can access, so you can try it out. That includes 2,000 runs per month, and that's per user, so within your organization, and it's pooled within your organization. So if you've got 10 people in your tenant and everybody gets 2,000 flow runs per month, but one person could use 5,000, and the total that you get is the 2,000 times your 10 users. And some differences though, if you go up in the licensing by buying one of the purchase plans like Plan 1 or Plan 2, you just get some different features and different additional runs per month. The checks are more frequent, so 3 minutes versus 5 minutes. With Flow Plan 1, you get the premium connectors. I meant to mention when we were looking at the connectors, some of them have a little premium icon at the bottom, and that means you can only access those if you have, or you can only use them if you have Flow Plan 1 or 2. Some examples of those are like Salesforce and the Common Data Service, so some sort of more premium services, I guess, are what you can access with the premium plan. And then Flow Plan 2 gives you the business process flows in addition to that, and more runs and more frequent checks. So some resources for further learning. I hope you found this useful, but we've really only touched the surface. There's so much to Flow, and new features are added basically weekly. So you can go on the Flow homepage, go to the Learn section, and that will take you to this Learn page, and you can start out with the I'm a beginner, and it takes you to things like instructional videos and basics and the documentation and just some really general information, and obviously then you can go to these different topics and find out more. I've also got a bunch of links here, and as I said, you'll get those with the slides. So for example, ones that I would particularly recommend would be going to the Flow community forum. There's quite a large community. If you have any questions or problems that you're running into with Flow, that's the best place to get an answer. You can go in there, see if maybe it's already been answered, or go in and ask your question, and that is monitored constantly, both by Microsoft and by the super users in the community who are always in there answering questions and helping people out. It's a really, really good resource. There's a resource list that was published a while back. It's still relevant though, because it lists a lot of articles and videos that have to do with just getting started or various levels in your Flow learning. I would also recommend, if you didn't already watch the Flow Online conference that there was in December, you can view all of the sessions now on demand via the link that I've posted here. You can go to my blog and look at my Flow articles, and I would definitely recommend following on Twitter the Microsoft Flow official account, and John Levesque, who is the Senior Flow Program Manager and is always doing videos and tweets about new information having to do with Flow. If you come up with new ideas for things that should be added as features, this is the link to go to here. It's within the Flow community, and that lets you see what ideas already exist, and you can upvote them if it's something that would be really useful to you, and you can submit your own ideas. So now, if you want to give feedback on this and put in a request for the slides, I've got a flow set up that will send you that. You can either use the QR code there or the little shortened URL to do that. And I will see if there are any questions.
Yep, absolutely. So just as a reminder, if you want to ask any questions, you can raise your hand using the GoToWebinar software. So you should see that little hand raise icon. If you click onto that, that will raise your hand and you can ask Sandy.
I'm not seeing anyone with their hand raised. Hopefully you found this useful. So comments or questions would be welcome.
Absolutely. Sandy, thank you so much. Feel free to stay on if you do have any questions. But also, you'll be doing a Power Apps webinar next week as well. So I think...
Well, a week after next.
Sorry, the week after next. Absolutely right. So in 2 weeks. Do you want to talk a little bit about that as well?
Sure. So yeah, if you're interested in learning something about Power Apps, that'll be on so I think that's the 31st, 2 weeks from today. And that'll be, again, an introductory webinar on Power Apps and giving you kind of a tour of the user interface and some of the things that you can do with it, including some demonstrations of the controls and how things work. So I'd invite you to come to that as well.
Fantastic, thank you. And I also don't see any raised hands yet. So once again, Sandy, do you want to give your email address should there be any questions, or the Twitter handle?
Sure. Yeah, sure.
Just to repeat that. And yeah, if there are any questions that you can think of, then please feel free to ask them there.
Yeah, sure. You can reach me on sandy@sandyu.com is my email address, and my Twitter handle is sandyu. Oh, there, Carl.
I think there is one raised hand.
Yeah. Hi, Carl.
Oh, hello. I was just asking about the deck. What needed to be done to get a copy of the deck you presented?
If you scan the QR code that's currently on the screen or go to the bit.ly URL at the bottom, then it lets you put in your email address, and then the deck will be emailed to you automatically.
Okay, I tried the URL, and the URL didn't work for me.
Oh, shoot, I'm sorry. Okay, well then, we have your address, so yeah, we'll make sure. Or maybe they'll all get sent out anyway.
Okay, appreciate it. Thank you.
Sure. Mm-hmm. Anything else?
Yeah, that looks like another question from Lise.
Lisa, did you have a question? I've unmuted you, Lisa. Oh. Okay. Did you have a question, Lisa? No, maybe not. She muted herself. Okay.
Alexandria. So, Alexandria, you're unmuted if you want to ask your question.
Hi, yeah, I was curious to go over that 2,000 runs per month, but I was a little confused on what that meant.
Sure. So a flow run is anytime the flow runs. So if it gets triggered and then it runs, that counts as a run. But so you're allotted up to 2,000 per month per user. But as I mentioned, that's aggregated. So if you've got 100 users in your tenant, then you have 2,000, yeah, whatever that is, 200,000, yes, flow runs for the whole organization per month,
Okay.
which you'd be pretty hard pressed to hit, I would think. Depending.
Okay, so it's not 2,000. That I just want to make sure it wasn't like 2,000 runs for only 100 for 100 users.
No, it's per user.
Okay, great.
Sure. Let's see. Sudhir? I've unmuted you, Sudhir. Did you have a question? Hello? Let's try Salim. Trying to unmute you. I'm not able to unmute you, Salim. Oh, there we go. Hi, Salim. Did you have a question?
I think maybe a bit of audio issues, perhaps from the attendees. So, yeah, I guess at that point, if there's any further questions that you do have, Salim, you can email those in to Sandy with the email address that she provided.
Yes.
But, yeah, thank you very much, Sandy. That was really informative. I think a great introduction to Flow, and I certainly learned a few things myself. So thank you very much for doing that. It's really valuable. So yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.